Okay, I'm going to get started. Welcome, everyone. For those who I don't know on this webinar, my name is Jason Chang. I am Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies here at the University of Connecticut. And I also direct the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. Now, this webinar is the next installment of our How to Teach series, really supporting and broadening, deepening the preparations for teachers and many other folks around the integration of Asian American studies into the K through 12 environment. And this particular webinar is really focused on high school teachers, where the content areas around U.S. history and global history would really, be able to include and benefit from the inclusion of the interdisciplinary study of the Vietnam War, right? So, so before we get started, I also just want to recognize that we here in Connecticut, where I am in central Connecticut, these are the ancestral lands of the Wangung, Tunxis, and Sikyog peoples, and that their absence is the condition of our presence. And wherever you are also on indigenous land, and we recognize this role, the way that military occupation and wars have continued that tradition, and perhaps also connecting to the legacy of the Vietnam War as another example of the continuation, the cycle of imperial wars. So, so with that, I want to welcome our esteemed panelists for this webinar. We are really lucky to have such amazing scholars of the Vietnam War to right here in New England with us. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll present today, and then I'll discuss a bit of our goals for this webinar and the roadmap, what you can sort of expect here. So first off, I want to introduce my colleague here at UConn, Professor Nu-Anh Tran. They're a historian of Vietnam and a professor here in the history department with me. And she teaches courses on Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and the Vietnam War. And her research is specifically on South Vietnam in the 1950s and 60s. Next, we have, next is in the presentation order is going to be Professor Ed Miller, and they're a historian, teacher, and digital humanist at Dartmouth College. He teaches courses on modern Vietnam, the Vietnam War, oral history, and other topics. So he travels frequently to Vietnam for research and teaching and to work on public history projects there. Professor Marguerite Nguyen teaches and researches American and Asian American literature at Wesleyan University. She specializes in refugee cultures and is currently working on a project on refugee ecologies, which I hope you'll be able to tell us more about. So this is a panel that we think is very timely in the sense that we're coming up on a big anniversary for the Vietnam War with 50 years in 2025, right, for the 50th year anniversary of the fall of Saigon, right? And so when we're kind of thinking about these bigger cycles of history and the legacy that war has had, and then we think also about the presence of other U.S. wars in the high school curriculum, really see a glaring absence in the treatment of the Vietnam War. So, so this webinar really is directed at some of these silences that are there for all students, but then particularly for Asian Americans, and even more specifically for Southeast Asians, to have one of the most important forces that shaped their lives and the reason for their many for their presence here in the United States not be treated at all feels like the really high need for improvement, and to do so in ways that challenge stereotypes and misconceptions and other other ways that our study of U.S. history has not given a fully formed, fully examined, multi-sided analysis of the war. So we're going to have each of the presenters give about 15 minutes a presentation that just really identifies some key resources that are going to open up the study of the Vietnam War, and then also provide a kind of walkthrough for some of their lesson, what they think of could be a really useful and constructive lesson in the classroom. And then I'm going to allow the panelists to talk about each other's work for a little bit, some crosstalk, and then we're going to turn it over to you all for some questions. So really looking forward to this. And I think we want to start first with some opening remarks. What do you think is important to teach about the Vietnam War, and what do you hope people, teachers, students will take away from this webinar? So first, let's have Nu-Anh go.
So I think one of the things that's really important to teach about the Vietnam War is that it was a war within American history, but it wasn't just a war within American history. And it was not just a war between Vietnam and the United States. It was also a war between competing groups of Vietnamese. I also think it's important to sort of acknowledge that it was also a war that affected Cambodians and Laotians and ethnic minorities within Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So all of those groups have very different experiences, and the panel won't cover all of them, but I think it's always really important to acknowledge that, because when you don't, a student whose family has been through that often feels like they've been erased from the history.
Thank you, Nu-Anh. Ed, would you go next?
Yeah, I agree very strongly with everything that Nu-Anh has said. When I teach the Vietnam War here at Dartmouth, I'm really emphasizing that it's not just an episode in American history. It's also a really important episode in Vietnamese and Southeast Asian history. And it was a civil war among Vietnamese. Most Americans don't realize that. But most Vietnamese who experienced the war are very aware of the Civil War qualities of the conflict. And so I think that's very important. And I think that's also important to understanding the experiences of Asian American, especially Vietnamese American students whose families were affected by the war, that the legacies of the war, the legacies of the war affect many Americans. But for Vietnamese Americans, there's some very distinctive legacies that go back to the fact that this was a civil war, a conflict that divided Vietnamese communities, in some cases Vietnamese families. And this is a really important thing to teach. The other thing that I'll mention here is that I think a lot of Americans have this idea, well, the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and then Vietnam and the United States sort of went their separate ways. And nothing could be further from the truth. As I'm going to talk about in my presentation, one of the consequences that was so impactful for both countries was the creation of large Vietnamese American communities in the United States. And those communities, those students, many of whom are now in our classes in the United States, have really shaped the subsequent history, both of the United States and of Vietnam. So I think Vietnamese American experiences are something that's very important to foreground.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Thank you, Ed. Yeah, and lastly, Marguerite.
Yeah, so I think that I follow very nicely on what Nu-Anh and Ed said, because the text that I'm going to be talking about emphasizes a similar point, in that war doesn't really end, and experiences of war and the memory of war, which often results in forced displacement, are continuing issues for refugee diasporas. Also, I think that the text that I'm going to be presenting on encourages us to think about the role of Vietnamese American literature or Southeast Asian American literature within American literature more broadly. And because the novel is set in the South, it's not a novel about Asian Americans in California. It also speaks to the heterogeneity of Asian American communities, particularly in the South. I also think that it's useful to think about this kind of growing field of refugee literature and the impact of refugee literature on American culture more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, we're really looking at, it feels in some ways like a renaissance in some sense of, the cultural production from Southeast Asian refugees is really kind of headlining national culture in some ways. So having this deeper background really feels necessary to understand the context of those accomplishments. And then just really want to underscore, for educators who are looking at sort of the mental health of their students, this may be the first time that for Southeast Asian students, this may be the first time that they're actually talking about the war. Some families prefer not to talk about because of the trauma, right? And so doing so in a way that's really contextualized by the Vietnamese experience, by the Southeast Asian context, I think is really important to kind of framing those things and not just from the US lens, right? So really these are just tremendous, contributions. So I'm going to get out of the way. I will help keep time, but really, I want to thank you all for coming and agreeing to do this webinar with me. So I'll sort of informally keep time here, and Nguyen, we're going to start with you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So I just wanted to say earlier, if someone saw me typing, that's because I'm getting emails from people asking me how to register. So I was trying to field those emails earlier, but hopefully that's done. So I just want to start by saying I'm really delighted to do this event for high school teachers. It was my high school history teacher who suggested that I become a history professor, and that is actually how I ended up where I am today. So in my course on the Vietnam War, I show 2 Vietnamese language movies that highlight opposing Vietnamese perspectives. And I have the DVDs of these movies, but my students tell me that they can find these movies online. So they're definitely available for free. So this first movie, and I guess you can't quite see it. There we go. Is Little Girl of Hanoi. It's also translated as Child of Hanoi, and I'll have a better picture on my slide in a moment. The movie is about a little girl and her family in Hanoi during an especially intense American bombing campaign in 1972. And I unblur the background so I can show up the other movie that I show in my class is Journey from the Fall. This is a Vietnamese-American movie. It's about a South Vietnamese family after the war. The father is imprisoned, and then the rest of the family escape Vietnam by boat and resettle in the United States as refugees. These 2 movies share the same overarching theme about family and community coming together during times of hardship and in the face of a common enemy. And there's actually quite a number of other thematic similarities between the 2 movies. Both of these movies are also very, very partisan. It's sort of a punch you in the face politics. And one of the things that is really useful about that is that it's really easy for students to pick up the political message of the movie. So they're really ready to discuss it the moment they finish watching the movie. It's not hard for them. Like, you don't have to work through a lot of, context for them to understand the politics of the 2 movies. So the North Vietnamese movie is very communist. The Vietnamese-American movie is very anti-communist. And these clashing perspectives encourage critical thinking. I would also say both of these movies are very emotionally compelling. They're both tearjerkers. I cry during both movies every time I teach them. And wherever your politics, you really feel for these characters whose homes are being bombed, or who are risking their lives to escape, or who are being mistreated in prison. So for me, pairing these 2 movies encourages both sort of an emotional response and also analysis. So it engages both heart and head. And for me, that is pedagogical gold, because the students really invest in the characters, and they find it really interesting, these clashing perspectives. So I'm going to talk about the North Vietnamese movie, Little Girl of Hanoi, that I use with my students. Ed will talk about the other movie. But all that said, both of these movies can also be used as standalone pieces. I should also say that I hope this was included. I'm not sure if this was included, but I have handouts on both movies, student handouts for both movies. I also have a teacher's guide for Little Girl of Hanoi. The student handout for both movies includes translations of all the songs that are in the two movies. So if you are musically inclined, you can teach these movies and as music. So I'm actually going to start sharing my screen now. So I can do. Okay, so Little Girl of Hanoi, and here we go. So Little Girl of Hanoi is a movie made in North Vietnam in 1974. It's about a little girl named Ngọc Hà and her family. Her family is devastated by an American bombing campaign in December of 1972. This campaign is called Operation Linebacker 2. The campaign is also known in the United States as the Christmas bombings. The movie depicts North Vietnamese people as victims of American bombing, and North Vietnamese soldiers and civilians are shown heroically trying to care for each other and defend their homeland. So in the movie, the little girl is searching for her father, and she's picked up by a kind soldier. There's an image of the girl with that kind soldier on the upper left-hand corner of the slide. And she tells the soldier about how the bombing killed her mother and almost killed her sister, and we learn about this through flashbacks. Now, despite this misfortune, Ngọc Hà and her family are helped by kind friends and strangers at every turn. There's a strange woman who rescues her Ngọc Hà's little sister, who is pictured in the middle picture on the slide. Ngọc Hà herself is cared for by her mother's friend, her teacher, her landlady, the kind soldier who picks her up. And then Ngọc Hà's mother, whose picture is on the lower left-hand corner of the slide, Ngọc Hà's mother sacrifices her own life to save strange children. In addition to all this, the girl's father, Ngọc Hà's father, and the soldier who picks her up both belong to North Vietnam's air defense forces, meaning the unit that shoots down the American planes that drop the bombs. And at the end of the movie, the friendly soldier who picks her up successfully shoots down an American B-52. The North Vietnamese government in this movie is shown as caring and competent. The government evacuates children out of the cities. It runs an effective air raid alert system. It distributes rice rations to city people. No one in this movie appears to be hungry or poor. And just about all the characters are depicted as good, happy people. Parents and teachers are always loving and caring. Soldiers, policemen, and strangers can always be trusted. Even the children in this movie barely ever misbehave. Now, the strength of this movie is that it helps students empathize with North Vietnamese people as human beings rather than just a monolithic enemy. You know, students will come away from this movie with a much better appreciation for how ordinary North Vietnamese experienced American bombing. But this movie is also challenging to teach because many viewers actually find it hard to tell the adult characters apart. They often don't appear on the screen at the same time, and they wear really similar clothing. So this is why I've included a fairly detailed plot summary in my teacher's guide. The student handout also lists the important characters. And when I teach this movie, sometimes I pause after key moments and check to see if my students understand the plot. So now I want to talk about how I would teach this movie in a history class. I imagine that a high school teacher might teach this movie as a part of a unit on the Vietnam War. So I would give students some background on the specific bombing campaign, Operation Linebacker 2, and its relationship to the ongoing peace talks between the United States and North Vietnam. And this is necessary because the movie never actually explains this context. It's never explained why the US is dropping these bombs. I would also talk briefly about how the North Vietnamese government tried to defend itself from American bombing and tried to minimize civilian casualties, because this is featured so prominently in the movie. And lastly, I would explain that North Vietnam was a highly authoritarian regime that made generous use of propaganda. Students often find this movie weirdly propagandistic, and they may not take it seriously. So understanding this context helps them understand that the movie was part of a larger informational and cultural system in North Vietnam. And all of these themes are covered in the teacher's guide. After showing the movie, I might ask students to analyze this movie as a primary source. What I find is that students sometimes think of primary sources in somewhat black and white terms, that they're either biased and untrustworthy or they're trustworthy. And I think this movie is good for teaching students to think about primary sources in a more complex way, that we can learn from a source precisely because it is biased, because it tells us something about the perspective of the people who produced it. So I might ask students, what can they learn from this movie? Now, I think that one of the things that students can very obviously learn from this movie is how the North Vietnamese government responded to American bombing, how North Vietnamese civilians experienced the bombing. Second, and most importantly, I would say that students can learn the official North Vietnamese interpretation of the war. The movie depicts the Vietnam War as between peaceful, patriotic Vietnamese and incomprehensibly violent Americans. And students can analyze the strategies that the filmmaker uses to try to convince the viewer to adopt this interpretation. I think using this movie as an example of the type of message that the North Vietnamese government wanted to present to its people, you could also ask students, what did the North Vietnamese government want its people to believe? How did it want its citizens to behave? And why might this interpretation have felt plausible to the people who watched this movie at the time? And you can also, of course, ask students what the movie's interpretation leaves out, or what the movie leaves out more generally. It leaves out any mention that the American pilots who were shot down in North Vietnam were often tortured. It ignores the fact that North Vietnam actually played a major role in escalating the war. It also ignores the Civil War aspect of the Vietnam War, that the war was also between different groups of Vietnamese, and there were plenty of Vietnamese who weren't on the communist side. Now, this movie can also be taught in an English class as part of a unit on Vietnam War literature or war and literature. And so I want to talk a little bit about how I might teach it in an English class, or how it might be taught in an English class. So for an English class, I would still cover the basic background of either the specific bombing campaign or the American bombing of North Vietnam in general. But then I would emphasize the centrality of propaganda and political indoctrination in North Vietnam, including the personality cult around Ho Chi Minh. I would also talk about North Vietnam's policy on art. So in North Vietnam, all art had to conform to a style or genre known as socialist realism. Socialist realism is a style of art that originated in the Soviet Union. It requires that all art serve the objectives of the Communist Party and be relevant to the working class. And these themes are covered in the teacher's guide as well. So after showing the movie, I would have students analyze the movie as an artistic representation of the Vietnam War. I might ask students, how does the movie exemplify the characteristics of socialist realism? How might the movie be different if it didn't adhere to socialist realism? I might ask students what aspects of this movie feel relatable and what aspects feel propagandistic. Why is this movie emotionally compelling despite being propagandistic? Why might people who lived through the bombing find this movie appealing? And are there any aspects of this movie that might be unappealing to people who've just lived through this major bombing campaign? I would also ask students, what role does Ho Chi Minh play in this movie? What does he symbolize? Because Ho Chi Minh was dead by the time of Operation Linebacker 2, and he's mentioned or actually appears in the movie several times. I think students will notice that the tone of this movie is very optimistic. And I might ask students, why would someone want to make such a feel-good movie about something so sad and so destructive like this bombing campaign? Is it ethical for artists to create feel-good art about things that are so violent and so destructive? How should war be represented? Should it be represented as a tragedy? Should it be represented as sort of something more ambivalent? Or how should it be represented? What are the ethics of that? I think students will also recognize right away that all the adult characters in the movie are uniformly kind and patient, and they never complain about the hardships of war. There's only one exception, and that is a very minor character who complains when he's waiting in line to pick up his government allocated rice rations, and he's pictured on the slide. I might ask students, why is this character depicted so negatively? Isn't it normal to complain at least a little bit if you're being bombed? What or who does this character represent? And lastly, I think I might ask students to think about what it might be like to grow up in a place where there's really only one interpretation of the war that you're living through. You know, North Vietnam was not like the United States. It wasn't even like South Vietnam. You know, both in South Vietnam and the United States, there was public debate on the war. There was art that was anti-war, there was art that was pro-war. In North Vietnam, there was really only one style of art, and all of it tended to have the same message. So what would it be like if you grew up in that sort of environment? Would it make you more likely to support the war because you were surrounded by this message? Would it make it harder for you to articulate negative feelings that you might have about the war? Would it raise unrealistic expectations about what your expectations for your fellow citizens or your expectations about the post-war future? So those are some of the questions that I would ask students to think about if I was teaching this movie as an artistic representation of the war. My teacher's guide for Little Girl of Hanoi includes a list of possible discussion questions. I personally like to have students write a one-page single-space journal prior to class discussion, and all of the discussion questions that are listed in the guide can also work as prompts for the journal. Additionally, I've also listed a couple of the type of works I think could be paired with Little Girl of Hanoi. You know, what novels, novellas, movies that can be paired with the movie. I should say I haven't read all of the things I recommend or watch all of them in full, but I wanted to bring up some possibilities. So the most obvious one, the one that I use, is I pair it with Journey from the Fall, the anti-communist Vietnamese-American movie that Ed will talk about next. This would give the students opposing the Vietnamese political perspectives and radically different interpretations of the war. Another possibility is Little Girl of Hanoi could be paired with post-war North Vietnamese literature that rejected socialist realism and was more critical of the war. This would give you an alternative interpretation of the North Vietnamese experience. And this would be especially good for an English class, I think, to compare socialist realism and the rejection of socialist realism. And lastly, I think this movie, I think Little Girl of Hanoi could be paired with movies about the American pilots who dropped the bombs and then became prisoners of war. That would give you a very different perspective on the bombing and on North Vietnam. And if you pair Little Girl of Hanoi with something else, I think you could ask students to either discuss or write on questions such as, how do these works portray the war? Who is the war between according to these works? And how do these works portray the other side, however the other side is defined? And at the end of the teacher's guide, there's a list of resources that I use to compile the guide. So if you want more information than what I've condensed on the guide. Lastly, I want to give a little plug to the Choices program that's run out of Brown University, develops curriculum for a variety of historical topics. Right now, they're developing a unit on the Vietnam War. Most of their stuff is rather expensive, but their videos are free. And I did a video with them, and I know that they did videos with a bunch of other scholars. And so on the screen is the URL for the videos that I did with them. And I know they have more videos coming. And these are very useful these are very short videos. They're really useful for teaching the war. So that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and yield the floor to Ed.
Okay, great. This is a great setup for me to talk about the other of the two films that Nu-Anh has mentioned, Journey from the Fall. Like Nu-Anh, I have often paired this film with the film that she explained so succinctly and thoroughly there, Little Girl of Hanoi. I think they do work pretty well together. With Journey from the Fall, this is a film that I've taught for many years now, and I've had so much success with it. And I have to say, I love this film and I love teaching about the film. And I just want to give you a couple of things about it that I really appreciate. The first thing is that this is a Vietnam War film that focuses on Vietnamese people. And that is not true of just about any Hollywood movie that's made about the Vietnam War. Almost all of the classic Hollywood films, from Platoon and Apocalypse Now, they don't represent Vietnamese at all, or Vietnamese are just very minor characters, or they're just victims or shadowy figures. And Journey from the Fall is a film that really centers Vietnamese experiences. Another thing that's great about this film is that it looks at the period after the end of the Vietnam War. And insofar as Americans know anything about Vietnam, their knowledge tends to end in 1975 when the war ends with the communist victory. And this film is a film that students can learn a lot from about what happened in Vietnam after the war, as well as the experiences of Vietnamese who became refugees after the war. So I think it's very valuable in that sense. A third thing that I really like about this film, and Nu-Anh talked about this film is a family story. It depicts the experiences of a Vietnamese family and their efforts to survive and escape oppression after the war. And I think the fact that this is a family story makes it relatable to students. Even students who don't know anything about Vietnam or Vietnamese culture, or even very much about the Vietnam War, can still find things in this film that interest them and that they can relate to. Parenthetically here, I will mention that I think one difference between this film and Little Girl of Hanoi is that even though this film is longer, it's over 2 hours, this film has a smaller group of core characters. There's really only about 7 major characters in this film. So in terms of the cast of characters, it's a little bit easier, I think, for students to keep track of the different characters in the film. The last sort of general feature of this film, Journey from the Fall, that I want to emphasize is that this is a Vietnamese-American film. The film was directed by Hàm Trần, who's a very accomplished Vietnamese-American filmmaker. And he has said that he made this film because he wanted to tell the experiences of Vietnamese who left Vietnam and eventually settled in the United States after the war. And as I mentioned earlier in this session, the creation of Vietnamese-American communities all over the country is a really important consequence of the Vietnam War. Before 1975, there were relatively few, almost no Vietnamese people living in the United States. Today, there are over 2 million Vietnamese Americans. Vietnamese is the 5th most commonly spoken language in the United States today. And in some parts of the United States, like the state of Texas, Vietnamese is the 3rd most commonly spoken language. So Vietnamese American history is Vietnamese history, but it is also American history. And all students, all American students of any background can learn something from it and can benefit from learning more about Vietnamese American history. I'm going to just very briefly talk about the content of the film. I don't have time here to summarize the entire plot. As I mentioned, this is a family film, and see if I can get my slides to work here. There are 4 main characters in the family that's at the center of the story. There's the father, whose name is Lom, the mother, whose name is Mai, their young son, whose name is Lai, and then the grandmother, Lom's mother, who's just known by the Vietnamese term for grandmother, Ba Noi. This film begins in Vietnam, and it begins at the end of the Vietnam War with the fall of Saigon, the final capture of Saigon by North Vietnamese forces. So that's the fall that's referenced in the title, Journey from the Fall. Lom, the father, is an officer in the now defeated South Vietnamese army. And like most of the Vietnamese who were linked to the South Vietnamese state and military after the war and who remained in Vietnam, he gets targeted for what the Vietnamese communist government called re-education. Re-education involved, for many South Vietnamese, it involved being sent to re-education camps. In theory, this was a benign process in which people would be indoctrinated in the ways of communism and then released. But in practice, the conditions at these camps were very harsh and very brutal. People were subjected to hunger and deprivation and torture and abuse, and many people died in these camps. And the film does not shy away from showing the suffering of the prisoners, especially the father Lom. Shortly after Lom gets arrested, early in the film, he tells Mai, his wife, to take the rest of the family, the son and the grandmother, and to flee Vietnam by boat. And Mai doesn't want to do this, but she agrees that it's the best thing for the family. So the three of them end up boarding this very rickety boat and sailing out to sea. And the three of them, the mother, the grandmother, and the daughter, will eventually make it to America, where they settle in California. Meanwhile, Loam remains in the Reeducation camp. And for much of the film, part of the dramatic tension is that the two parts of the family don't know each other's fate. They don't know if, Loam doesn't know if his family has survived and made it to America. And conversely, the family members in America are wondering about Loam and his fate. A couple of things to know about this film that are relevant to teaching it. Most of the film is in Vietnamese, so it has subtitles. But in my experience, the subtitles are pretty good. The subtitles, students don't have much trouble. The subtitles, the conversation or the dialogue in the film is very conversational, and students don't complain too much about reading and understanding the subtitles. A more challenging aspect about teaching and watching this film is that this film, like Little Girl of Hanoi, is much of the film is presented in a non-linear form. So the events are told out of the sequence in which they happen. And in this case, in Journey from the Fall, the action not only switches between Vietnam and other locations at sea and in the United States, but it also jumps around a lot in time. And the director does not always give you cues as to when these time shifts have taken place. So the effect of this is to generate a certain amount of confusion in the audience while they're watching the film. And I think it's interesting. One of the things that you can discuss with your students is, why does the director do this? Why does he present this story in such a way that people feel confused about what time it is and what has happened and what is still to come? And I think that the answers to this are that he's trying to get you, the audience, to identify with the characters in the film. And as I said, the characters in the film often don't know the fates of the people on the other side. And so that tends to be the effect of watching the film. The confusion that you experience as watching the film means that you're not the omniscient audience. You don't always know the fates of all of the characters. You're not exactly sure who might be dead or alive at a particular moment. Another thing that I've already mentioned here is that the film is somewhat long. It's about 2 hours and 15 minutes. The film is widely available on DVD. It's not available via the most popular streaming platforms like Netflix or Prime Video, but you can get a copy on DVD for about $10. Just a couple of things about how to teach this film. I've provided 2 handouts in the materials that will be shared with you. One of them is an information sheet for teachers. And what I've done here is I've listed out a cast of characters, and I've given you short descriptions of the 7 characters who are the most important characters in the film. And I think that's actually a useful thing to review with the students after they've watched the film, is just to go through and make sure that they can put names to faces for these core 7 characters. I think another step that's very important when you're teaching the film after students have watched it is to do a little bit of a plot reconstruction. Once you've watched the whole film as an audience member, you find you are able to put the sequence back together. But sometimes students want to talk through that process. And so that can be a good sort of opening exercise on the day that you're discussing this film after the students have watched it. Beyond that, the second handout that I've provided here gives you a series of discussion prompts. And I'll let each of you take a look at those. Just very briefly, I have a question about why the filmmaker chose to put the film together in this nonlinear format. That's often generative of some very interesting discussion. I have a question about the three female characters in the film, the three main female characters, and how their experiences are depicted. All of them are suffering in some ways. And I think it's interesting to ask what the purpose of that suffering is, what the filmmaker wants us to take away from it. I think it's very different in many ways from the suffering, and specifically the female suffering that we see in Little Girl of Hanoi. So again, there's an interesting contrast to be made there. Another interesting element of this film is this film makes reference to a Vietnamese legend. The legend involves a 15th century Vietnamese king who was actually a real life historical figure named Le Loi. And the legend actually involves one of his commanders, a man named Le Lai. And in this legend, Le Lai sacrifices himself to save his king. And this legend is brought up several times in the film. And so I think this can also be an interesting topic of conversation with the students. You can ask them what the filmmakers are after here in invoking this legend, and how some of the characters in the movie are actually telling or retelling this legend for particular purposes. One thing that I should add right here is that the film, even though the film was released almost 20 years ago, they've maintained an excellent website on the film that has a lot of really great information, and I've included the URL for that website in the handout. And I've linked specifically to the page on the website in which they discuss this legend, the legend of Le Loi and Le Lai. And that, I think, is something that you can actually have the students refer to while they're discussing this particular question of the legend and the use of the prompt. One final point that I'll make about the film, which I think is also relevant to discussion, is that, as you will see, the film does not have the stereotypical Hollywood happy ending. That is, I think, also an interesting question to ask the students, is why did the filmmakers choose not to have the happy ending in which everybody escapes and successfully and everybody reunites happily in the United States? Some of the characters make it to the United States, but others do not. And I think that's a very important thing to get the students to think about. I think this has to do with the director's interest in telling stories about Vietnamese and telling all the stories of people who didn't make it, the people who died in the re-education camps, and the many, it's estimated, hundreds of thousands of people who didn't make it because they died at sea, or in some cases were killed at sea during their attempts to flee Vietnam during the 1970s and 1980s. So I'm going to conclude there and turn things over to Marguerite.
Great, thank you so much. That was like a perfect transition into what I'm talking about with regard to Eric Nguyen's novel, The Things We Lost to the Water, which was published in 2021. Also briefly, just thanks again to Jason for organizing this, and to Nu-Anh for coordinating us and getting us together. I'll just talk briefly about the plot of this novel before we get into like the issues and questions. The Things We Lost to the Water is an intergenerational narrative. It spans 27 years. And within the chronology of the events treated in the story, it starts with a Southern Vietnamese family's boat journey from Vietnam to the US in 1978. And it ends with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So it's a 27-year span that covers major political and climate events, and sort of speaks to the connection between conflict and climate, what we often refer to as climate change today. Much of the novel concerns the family's struggles to survive and adapt to a new home. And some prominent themes that relate to that idea include the loss of home, the loss of nation, the loss of family members. There are also treatments of racism and homophobia in the US, continued cycles of political environmental vulnerability, both in Vietnam and in the US, and also the challenges of memory and documenting refugee life. So these are some of the prominent themes that I think you can pick up on in the novel, and they are included in the handout that I made. I think the novel is very readable, and because it's intergenerational, it gives you an idea of the sort of shared experience of Vietnamese refugees, but also how they differ from generation to generation. And I think that's very useful for students today. A little bit about the style of the novel, because I think that's really, really important. It's told in limited third-person perspective. Most chapters alternate between or among 3 different characters' points of view. So Huong is the mother, Thuan is the older son, and Ben is the younger son. The father is absent throughout much of the story because he, the moment when they step onto the boat to leave, he decides to stay and not go with them because he's so attached to his memories in Vietnam. He's a professor who has to go to a re-education camp that I just described. And that's a very kind of vexed relationship or issue for the family members, is their differing relationships to this absent father figure. A little bit about Eric Nguyen. I tend to like to give bios of authors, especially if they're writers of color, and especially if they talk about their background in interviews, because it, plays a role in the craft of their writing. So Eric Nguyen is from Maryland. He's based in Washington, D.C. He's editor of a website called diacritics.org, which is a website of diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian arts and culture. It's a great resource if you want to look at it. I believe I put it on the handout. He has an MFA from McNeese State University in Louisiana and credits his time there as sort of generating this interest in the community, in the Vietnamese-American community in New Orleans, and feeling the need to write about their story. The Things We Lost to the Water is Nguyen's debut novel, and he is currently at work on a second novel. I also often like to play videos or audios of authors reading from their work or giving interviews or doing Q&A, because I find that especially for maybe the students of color in the classroom, it's actually really meaningful for them to see writers, talking in the flesh, and well, not in the flesh in the classroom, but digitally in the flesh, and also just sort of seeing how their mind works. So let me switch to my PowerPoint and share my screen. So here I have kind of highlighted a couple possible frameworks that you could use if you were teaching this novel. Again, as I said at the beginning, I think this novel is really great for thinking about war and migration as ongoing experiences for Vietnamese refugees. And again, Ed talked nicely about this as well. There are cycles of migrations, and memory making is a constant in these characters' lives. At the same time, I think it's important not to reduce the characters to tragedy and trauma alone, and to think about how they actually exert agency over their lives and their stories. And I think in this novel, memory and storytelling become really important processes by which they do that. And I like to think of this as refugee world building, because they are basically constructing these new lives, these new worlds in these new places. On the handout, I sort of highlight key dates that I think would be important for students to be able to orient themselves in this novel. I think there are 2 timelines that would be helpful for them. One is the history of Vietnamese migration to New Orleans. And I'm not going to go over this here, but a couple of things to note about that history is the unique dimension to the community there, where most Vietnamese Americans in New Orleans have migrated together as a community 3 times. So a lot of them are from the same villages in northern Vietnam. They migrated to South Vietnam after the partition in 1954, and then they migrate to the US and try to reconstitute their communities in New Orleans, beginning in 1975 onward. And also the Catholic Church plays a huge role in resettlement efforts in New Orleans. So basically the Archbishop of New Orleans visits the refugee camp in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas in 1975 and sponsors thousands of Vietnamese refugees to come to New Orleans. And then the second timeline that I think would be helpful for students is how Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. So there's some dates in the handout. that show how it evolved from a storm to a tropical storm to a hurricane, got downgraded back to a tropical storm, and then doubled in size, and then got upgraded to a Category 5 storm, and just became a incredibly massive and destructive hurricane. Also, another thing to note about Hurricane Katrina is that the area in which the New Orleans Vietnamese Americans live, which is New Orleans East, and a kind of outskirt part of New Orleans that is still part of New Orleans proper. It just is kind of a neglected area because people forget about it. And it doesn't sort of fit the more iconic like French Quarter Garden District iconography of New Orleans as a city. It's a majority Black and Vietnamese American part of New Orleans. That area actually started flooding before Hurricane Katrina made landfall because the levees were breached or overtopped. And well, here's a picture of the hurricanes just so that you can see how big it was. And this is a resource that you might go to with your students, an interactive map of how New Orleans flooded. It's, I think helpful for students who are especially visual or appreciate a kind of interactive engagement with, with what they're, the material that you're treating in class. But in short, New Orleans East started to flood before the storm actually made landfall. And so I think that helps students get an idea of just the role of water in the imaginaries of the people who live in this area. Okay, so for me, one way to kind of get into the complexities and the nuances of this novel would be to focus on the motif of the bayou or the motif of water. I think sometimes grounding the students in a particular like trope or motif or recurring theme helps them to get into like the nitty-gritty of a literary text. And for me, the bayou becomes this really important motif because it is basically the space of memory making for refugees. It embodies memories of Vietnam, and it also speaks to their evolving lives in New Orleans in the present. So water has a way of morphing across the story that in a way that allows the characters to see themselves as both New Orleanian and Vietnamese. And so contrary to, I think, narratives that you might see in the media or dominant narratives that, kind of treat the war as over and would prefer to maybe separate Vietnamese American lives from their past. Here, water forces you to confront the fact that Vietnam and the war, or their memories of the war, are ever present in the characters' lives. So I just included some quotes that speak to that, to the role of water in that function. And I think water is also, because of the boat journey and because of the hurricane, it's both a destructive force and a creative force. And I think that's really useful to note, the role of water in terms of activating memory for the characters and in terms of activating storytelling for the characters. Some more quotes related to that idea. And I think that, one thing about this novel that is useful for a literature course and for thinking about what literature can do in terms of our knowledge about the Vietnam War is its emphasis on the act of storytelling itself. So, sorry, let me go back. Let me highlight this quote right here. This is a quote from Ben, who is one of the main characters in the novel, and he's the younger son, who was born in the US, and so he doesn't have the same kind of memories of Vietnam as his older brother and his mother do. And he says, quote, "No matter how horrible things turned out, he was the one who wrote it. That was the important part, to be the writer of his own story." And I think that really speaks to some of the comments that others have been making throughout, this webinar, which is that often in mainstream narratives about the Vietnam War, about Vietnamese Americans are often marginalized or muted. And this novel really emphasizes the importance of recognizing their voices and recognizing their perspectives. So memory and storytelling become important ways in which refugees do rebuild their lives and create worlds in their new homes. I put up images of the Bayou here because I think some students might not be might not sort of know what a Bayou is. So it could be useful to include that because it helps you to visualize, what the characters are going through or what they're doing when they keep talking about this Bayou and projecting memories onto it or having memories activated because of it. Some sample assignments for this text. I like to do a combination sometimes of critical activities and creative activities. For a critical or analytical assignment, one thing that you could do would be to have students analyze 1 to 2 passages, say, related to a recurring motif or trope or theme in the narrative. So for example, they could sit with a couple of passages about the Bayou or about water, and the instructor could choose those passages, or you could allow the students to choose those passages, encourage them to mark it up, to note what stands out to them, what confuses them, and what they would like to talk about. Also, they could compare and contrast how 2 different characters' perspectives on the same scene or the same experience how are they similar? How are they different? Why would Eric Nguyen choose to tell the story in this way, right? Had to narrate this novel through the perspective of different characters. I think that kind of builds in a kind of comparative function where students can get an idea of how complex the story of this one family is. A longer assignment could be to trace how, say, 3 to 4 representations of water evolve across the novel. What are the images, adjectives, and verbs that are associated with it? And how do these change or stay the same across the narrative? And what is the significance of this? As far as creative assignments, you kind of have to obviously gauge, what works for the students. And whether they would respond well to this kind of assignment or not. But I find that sometimes a personal reflection or bringing in their personal connection to recurring themes in the story is very helpful and can give them an entry point into a work that's very effective. So for example, they could write about something that they lost that was meaningful to them, and how did they try to preserve the memory of this loss, because loss is such an important aspect of the characters' lives in this novel. They could also reflect on how the Vietnam War has touched them or someone in their community, and think about what stands out to them in that story. If they don't know anyone directly affected by the war, they could reflect on who they might want to talk to about it, and what they would want to know, or what they would like to ask that person. It doesn't have to actually take place. It could just totally be an imagined conversation. And I could imagine some interesting things coming out of that. Like maybe they want to talk to Ocean Vuong, right? Big Connecticut writer. What would they want to ask him? And Connecticut has some pretty, interesting ties to the Vietnam War in terms of gun manufacture, in terms of drug manufacture, which was, a very the Connecticut pharmaceuticals had a big role to play in opioid addiction post-Vietnam War. So I think sometimes creative activities could be very helpful for the students to kind of get into the text. I listed some other recurring issues and themes on the handout. You could go really deep into the stylistic aspects of the novel in terms of the third-person narration and free and direct discourse and what it means to have access to these characters' thoughts without actually using the first person. What's the role of the novel versus other literary forms such as journalism, short story, poetry, autobiography, bigger questions concerning Asian Americans and the US and global South. There's also a lot of care and kinship among different marginalized characters in the novel. So Vietnamese characters, Black characters, and queer characters are helping each other and caring for each other. And I think that's really important. And again, something I mentioned at the very beginning, what's the role of refugee literature in American literature? There's a lot you could do with eco-critical approaches. What's the role of the inhuman or non-human environment in relation to the human experiences? For a more social scientific approach, you could compare the lived experiences as depicted in the novel in relation to, say, the oil industry, which has everything to do with the environmental changes there, as well as environmental policy. So.
I don't know how to thank you all enough. This was tremendous. And I feel like I have so many questions about the how we use aesthetic choices, or how we analyze the aesthetic choices of the writers and the directors and the actors, etc., to tell these stories. So I'm incredibly grateful. Everyone who's on the webinar, I've linked the teaching guide in the chat, and feel free to download that and share it, use it any way that you want. And before I ask the panelists if they have any questions for each other, I forgot to lift up Nu-Anh's work in coordinating and curating these colleagues and bringing us together. This was such a joy to learn from you all, and I want to take all of your courses, experience you guys in the classroom. So this is really, really wonderful. So I have a few other questions. I know the audience might have some questions. So why don't we, for the audience, if you're tuning in, you have questions, put them in the chat and I will make sure we ask them. In the meantime, I want to invite the panelists to reflect on the presentations. Were there other things that came up for you, other connections, maybe other resources that you thought of during the presentations?
Well, I actually have a question for Nu-Anh about teaching Little Girl of Hanoi, because as I mentioned, I've also done it and had good success with it. One of the things is that, of course, this is a Vietnamese film. The characters are all Vietnamese, but the United States is there, right? And the United States, of course, is carrying out the bombing. And there are actually Americans who appear in the film. There's one scene where there are some American prisoners who are pilots who have been shot down. And I found that students often have a reaction to that. And then there's also the scene at the end of the film where there's the big climactic battle, right? What the Americans called the Christmas bombing of Hanoi. And in the film, the portrayal is that the North Vietnamese air defenses are successful in shooting down these American bombers. And what I found with teaching with American students is that this is somewhat jarring for them, and not all of them perhaps, but some of them say this, to see Americans as prisoners, and also to see a war movie where the Americans are the bad guys. And I'm wondering if that's also something that's come up when you've taught the class.
I think the first time I taught that movie in the United States, I taught overseas before I came to UConn. So the first time I taught that movie in the United States, some students did say that. When I asked them about the movie, the first thing they said was, it's anti-American. And I was like, well, I would expect it to be. Like, there's nothing surprising about that. But I have found that students don't actually bring that question up. After that first year, students have not brought that up. And I'm not sure if it's because I have taught the class differently or I've given them more background, so they're just not surprised by it. I think that might be the reason. Before, in my course on the Vietnam War, I also have them read Lê Ly Hayslip's When Heaven and Earth Change Places. So they've already seen different portrayals of the Americans, not the entire book, but part of it. So I think by the time we get to the movie, they've seen positive and negative portrayals of so many of the different groups that I think it doesn't faze them anymore.
Mm-hmm. Nguyen, Marguerite?
I have a question about challenging conversations that come up when you're teaching, and if there are any moments that come to mind in your experiences, like in terms of, for example, portrayals of violence, things like that, like have certain things, recurring things come up and how you deal with that, because it's something I'm always thinking about as a teacher.
Well, certainly when you teach about war, and when you're teaching about, when you're using testimony, whether it's fictional or personal testimony, I use both when I'm teaching about the Vietnam War. Violence is pretty central. And I think the challenge is always that when students read or see a film representation of violence is, it's normal to have this emotional response to it. And, I'm thinking about when I teach students about the My Lai massacre, that there's no two ways about that. That's a really, really tough experience. And I feel like the challenge on the one hand is to sort of validate that the students, the emotional response and say, this is normal and this is good that you're having an emotional response, but also to try to get to a point where it's not just an emotional response for them, where they can actually say, okay, what are some of the meanings here? So if this is in a novel, what is the meaning? If this is from an oral history, how did the individual understand this, or how is the individual remembering this? And so that's what I'm trying to do. But it's hard. It's difficult. There's no two ways about it.
I find that one thing I do, and I don't know if I've talked about it in quite those terms. One thing I do is I often ask students, like, the people that were reading in this particular source, how do they understand the war? Who's the perpetrator of violence? Who are the people being victimized by the violence? How does the representation of violence tie into how they interpret the war or understand their experience, and which side they tend to choose, or which side they choose at any particular point? I find that that's not just the violence itself, but how people interpret it and understand that experience of violence that I think is makes it a little bit more meaningful, and makes it and moves it beyond just the sort of emotional response to it.
I think sometimes drawing a contrast between in the Vietnam War, in lots of narratives of the Vietnam War, both Vietnamese and American, there's often a lot of heroism that's being constructed, right? And so you have your heroes and you have your villains, and sometimes the violence is in the service of that, in either identifying someone who can overcome violence, or who can use violence in a constructive way, versus somebody who's using violence in an evil or despicable way. And certainly in Little Girl of Hanoi, I think you see this. You see the heroes, the heroism of the North Vietnamese actors, and then also there's this clear condemnation of the American perpetrated violence and the bombing. In Journey from the Fall, I think it's often a little bit different, and the violence there is part of the experience and something that the characters are overcoming, but it's also something that they don't completely overcome. And this gets back to what you said, Marguerite, about how the war never ends, and the legacies of violence are never something that you completely put behind you. And so that right there, distinguishing between those two modes of thinking about and remembering violence, that can sometimes be helpful for students.
Yeah, that was a really great question. Thank you for asking that. We have a question from the audience. This may be directed to Nu-Anh, but I think if anyone wants to respond, it would be lovely. So this says, you mentioned the propagandistic nature of North Vietnamese artwork. Do you compare and contrast that with war propaganda art put out by Western countries, US, UK, and France?
So in my class, I do teach a separate class on the Vietnam War that's not about the history, but that's about Vietnam War through literature. I actually don't contrast it with the United States and France as much as I contrast it with South Vietnam, and I contrast it with post-war Vietnamese art. And the reason is just because I'm trained as a historian of Vietnam. So I'm much more comfortable with the Vietnamese material than I am with like Western material. But one work that I think does sort of, it's similar to socialist realism, but not quite, but I have used in my class, is the movie The Green Berets, and also The Ballad of the Green Berets. It's it's also this triumphalist, heroic depiction of war.
Yeah, that's probably the most famous American propagandistic pro-war version. I have also used, as far as propaganda goes, a song, a popular song that was performed in the early 1970s after the revelations about the My Lai massacre. As some of the audience will know, the most infamous character in the story of My Lai was one of the lieutenants in the U.S. Army Company who was particularly brutal. His name was William Calley. And I think students, when they read about Calley and they read about the horrible things he did at My Lai, they just naturally assume that, oh, well, most Americans must have condemned that. And that wasn't the case. Actually, Americans were quite divided. Just as they were divided about the war, they were divided how to feel about William Calley. And this song is called the Battle Hymn of William Calley. And it's sung to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic that we all know, but it's a story about Calley, and it's about basically about justifying him and how he was sent off to war to serve his country, and he did this loyally, and it sort of offers this very kind of sanitized version of what actually happened at My Lai. And that, I think, is a useful tool to show students that, in the United States during the Vietnam War, even in the face of indisputable evidence of American atrocities and American war crimes, Americans were split over how to think about these horrible actions by U.S. military personnel. So I've gotten good use out of that source.
Can I make a suggestion too? That's a really great question. I teach a Vietnam War literature and film course, and I use the book Bloods, which is, as I think you all know, a collection of African-American oral testimonies or narratives related to the Vietnam War. It's all by Black veterans who served. And there's also some audio that was, I think, made as an accompaniment to those oral narratives, where Wallace Terry, who is a really important, prominent Black journalist, basically went out into the field and interviewed Black soldiers about their experience in the war. And it's super interesting because you get such a variety of perspectives, where some of them are talking about basically like American propaganda about the military and its heroism versus the critiques of that propaganda versus Black prisoners of war who were used by the Northern Vietnamese kind of propaganda machine for their own purposes. So it's a super interesting juxtaposition that I think does speak to this question about different forms of propaganda coming from different parties involved.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. I'm also thinking, please go ahead.
That Vietnam War propaganda is in many ways still being made, right? Even though the war is over. And there's a documentary film that was made by the American filmmaker Rory Kennedy, who happens to be the youngest daughter of Robert Kennedy. It's called Last Days in Vietnam. And it's about the fall of Saigon, and it really focuses on the events of April 1975. And it's in many ways an impressive film. I think its use of archival footage is positively brilliant. But the messages of this film are, from a historical standpoint, very problematic. It's basically a white savior film. It's a film in which white Americans are sort of lionized. We're back to that heroic mode again, for all that they supposedly did to save South Vietnamese and help them get out of South Vietnam in the last days of the war, which is not to say that the events it portrays are necessarily inaccurate, but the way in which the narrative is crafted, I think, serves a certain purpose, and it also endorses a very what historians call a revisionist view of the end of the Vietnam War, which has the effect of actually exonerating the United States and U.S. government leaders for some pretty horrible policy decisions. So the propaganda, I mean, that film, I think, is now probably came out about 8 years ago or something like that. But propaganda like the war itself, the propaganda keeps coming.
That is fascinating. I didn't know about that, so I have some homework to do. I mean, in connection to this and its multiple interpretations, and and I liked how everyone is helping to explain the multiple, what do we say, the narrative plurality around all of these different ways that the war has shaped people's lives. And I also teach Martin Luther King Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam speech, which really helps to put some of the American context into play, and it more in general think about the war as it's portrayed through these propagandistic forms, but then also how do other people interpret it through their own life circumstances at the same time. So yeah, these are really powerful sources that I think put together really help to develop those critical thinking skills around evaluating and questioning sources. And and I love what you said about like bias actually teaches a lot about the source, right? That's where we get to examine those claims and those positions of subjectivities. So, and I'm also really appreciative of the point you were making, Ed, too, about wartime racialization, particularly around Caffey's, the battle hymn piece, because that and the way that Southeast Asians were racialized as an enemy in the war carries over then into the way that Southeast Asians are treated in the United States as refugees, as immigrants later, and so the war, and this is one of the things I think Asian American Studies has done really well, is to show how U.S. wars have always been a part of that form of domestic racism, and so examining the sort of historical political mechanics of how the war was carried out and how it affected people and the sides that they took, their interpretive positions on it, gives us a lot to understand in terms of when we're at a point now in American culture where we're saying stop Asian American hate, or that we see this surge in anti-Asian racism. Well, these have historical precedents built into these kinds of historical silences that if we don't talk about these things, we can't unearth them and examine the long legacy they have for us. So this is really a tremendous thing. And one thing I would maybe have us begin to, we're going to start wrapping up soon, but I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on how you incorporate those other Southeast Asian voices. We've been talking about mostly Vietnamese, but really thinking on, the way that we framed the war first as a civil war, right? But then there's other ethnic minorities that become key players in how that's carried out, how the U.S. carries out its war, through like the recruitment of Hmong people into the war effort. Are there other things that you found that have been really constructive, and what role does that play in kind of complicating even that complicated story, but providing another kind of dimension? Because when I enter into Asian American history, into this phase, and start examining, say, like refugee laws and the arrivals of different groups, that there's a lot of attention on that immediate exodus, but then it gets more complicated the longer you go out, and being able to I don't end up spending a lot of time on the war, But I think understanding the war better then allows you to understand those flows, those arrivals later. So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
My take on refugees, and especially with regard to the Vietnam War, is it's really just a lens into something that is understudied in American history and literature, which is the fact that refugees have always comprised America. And in fact, it was settled by for people who were forcibly displaced from somewhere and were selectively given refugee status to settle land. And Louisiana is a great example of that, because the history of Louisiana is basically Cajuns, Maroons, refugees fleeing the Haitian Revolution. It stretches all the way from the earliest days of that colony to the present. And so I think that what we do is really, it's not necessarily unprecedented, because refugee history has always been part of American culture. But I think back to your question, Jason, about other Southeast Asian groups, I really like the poetry of Mai Der Vong. I teach Mai Der Vong's poetry a lot, because I think that she gets to this issue of the Hmong population, and what does it mean to write poetry from the perspective of a culture that has been seen as not having a written language, and the conundrums that come with that. I also like to teach Riti Pang's movies, French Cambodian or Cambodian French filmmaker who basically writes about the genocide in Cambodia, but tries to self-consciously build in an inability to fully represent the story. And so the missing picture uses, clay figurines to represent characters. And it's just a really poignant way of getting to the losses and the ways in which you still try to build stories to document what's left out of the historical record. So I think those two folks are people that I think are very effective in teaching or treating the issues that you mentioned.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
So, Jason, your question makes me think of one of the points that Marguerite made in her presentation on the novel, which is that many of the refugees who end up in Louisiana, that refugee journey from Vietnam to the United States was not the first time they had become refugees, right? And refugees' experiences run through the entire history of the Vietnam War, before 75 and after. So the most, I think, best known example of this comes in 1954 and 55, where you have this huge movement of population when the two Vietnams are divided at the Geneva Conference. There's a 300-day period of free movement, and nearly 1 million people move from North Vietnam to the South. And they very quickly become sort of caught up in the Cold War politics of the moment. And in the United States and elsewhere, they are represented as refugees from communism. And then, of course, during the war itself, there's an enormous number of people who become refugees within Vietnam, especially in South Vietnam, probably in the millions. And this was a function of military policy. The United States and South Vietnam would often destroy people's homes and make them become refugees, because that was actually part of the strategy to force them to move into refugee camps so they could be better controlled and separated from the communist forces. So it really is essential to not just think about Southeast Asian refugee experiences as beginning in 1975 or beginning after the war, but to look at them in this longer history and context of war and upheaval and displacement.
I find it very hard to cover so much in a single course on the Vietnam War. My course on the Vietnam War really emphasizes the inter-Vietnamese dimension and the competing Vietnamese groups. But one of the things I'm working on is I wanted to develop a separate course where about a third of it will look at the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. I'm also revising my survey of Vietnamese history. And my plan, I haven't done this yet, is to revamp the section on the Vietnam War to talk about it as a war that also affected ethnic minorities in Vietnam. So if you think about the way, there's a lot of scholarship on racial minorities in the United States during the Vietnam War. We know about African-American experiences of the Vietnam War, for example. We know about women's experiences of the Vietnam War. But when you look at Vietnam, we don't know that much about the experiences of ethnic minorities within Vietnam during the war. There's some scholarship, but there's not a lot. So my plan for that course is to revamp that section and connect it to this longer history of Vietnamese encroachment on the indigenous land of other people who were living in what is now Vietnam. That most of Vietnam, most of South Vietnam, pretty much all of South Vietnam was once the indigenous, belonged to other indigenous groups, not the Vietnamese, and to try to understand the Vietnam War within that longer history. That's one thing that I like to do in my course, but I'm not quite there yet.
Mm.
Yeah, Vietnam has its own colonization history and its own version of what Americans call manifest destiny. There's something in Vietnamese historical about the Southern advance, and which is a very well established motif in Vietnamese writing, and it's really interesting to look at that. I talk a little bit about that in my course in Vietnam War, but as Nu-Anh said, there's too much to cover. At Dartmouth, we have a quarter system, so we only have like 10 weeks, and so it's impossible.
Wow, yeah, that's tremendous. I mean, that particular challenge is hard, but the responses were so rich. Thank you, guys. Thank you all. The poetry recommendations, the other film recommendations. These resources, these are, what we like to, point out when we're thinking about curriculum making at the high school level. We want to introduce vetted resources, right? So really appreciate that. But more importantly than the vetted resource is actually having those conversations, then thinking about pedagogy and wrestling with those difficult, dialogues around interpretation, around the politics of memory, and whose memories get remembered or called history, and so I hope that for anyone who watches this, that you do find these films and these materials and you introduce them into your classroom, but that you continue the conversation around around the pedagogy around teaching the Vietnam War, and continue to engage and learn and build, a deeper awareness of many of these issues that students can explore this in a really rich way, one that maybe connects to other refugee experiences, maybe if they're from Africa, right, or other wars that are more recent, say like the conclusion of the Afghanistan war and the surge in refugees that came at that point, right? So there's a number of ways that the Vietnam War becomes, a really important way to analyze other parts of U.S. history and culture, and really hope that this is just maybe one step in that longer evolution. So really, thank the panelists. Thank you so much for spending this beautiful afternoon online with me and with the folks here. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you for joining us. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions you want to follow up with the panelists. Again, thank you all.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks also to everyone who attended, because what you do matters to what we do. So really appreciate it.
I echo what Marguerite just said.
Awesome. Have a good night, everyone.